If we're going to talk about Jeconiah and his curse upon his seed, then we also have to talk about his descendant named Zerubbabel. Now again, as we all know, the curse was put upon Jeconiah in Jeremiah 22. Now from Jeconiah came Shealtiel and Pedaiah, and from Pedaiah came Zerubbabel. And of course, there's the debate on whether or not Shealtiel was actually the uncle of Zerubbabel. But that's not really important for this issue right now, because since Shealtiel and Pedaiah were both from Jeconiah, that means that the curse of Jeconiah would apply to both of them as well. But nevertheless, here is where we experience yet again another problem that the anti-birthers have. Now, some of them will assert that the curse of Jeconiah must have been lifted by the time Shealtiel and Zerubbabel came into the picture. And again, the problem is that they don't have any biblical proof of that being the case. Here's why. First of all, Shealtiel was not a king of Judah. Second of all, Zerubbabel was not a king of Judah either. He was appointed by Cyrus the Great to be a governor of Judah. Zerubbabel being appointed as governor of Judah does not mean that he was a king. It does not mean that the curse of Jeconiah was lifted. There is no scripture anywhere in the Bible where God proclaimed that the curse would be lifted or that Zerubbabel would be appointed to take the throne of David. So even though Zerubbabel found favor in God's eyes, the curse of Jeconiah still applied even to him. But then that leads us to another challenge. If the curse of Jeconiah still applied to Zerubbabel, then what's the deal with Haggai chapter 2 verse 23, which says, "In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, son of Shealtiel, saith the Lord, and will make thee as a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts." Okay, first of all, we have to read and understand the context. But before we start, let's briefly reiterate the facts. Now, as we can clearly see in Scripture, there was no monarch over Judah after Zedekiah, who was the last king of Judah. The throne was not given or appointed to anyone after him, including Zerubbabel and his children. So as we can obviously see, Haggai 2:23 does not prove that Zerubbabel was made a king of Judah, even though he was an honorable man in the history of Israel and Judah. So we can still assert that Zerubbabel was still subject to the curse of Jeconiah. Now, you may have an issue with God using the words, "and I will make thee as a signet" towards Zerubbabel, and then cross-reference that with Jeremiah 22:24. And I would simply respond to that, so what? What does that prove? Absolutely nothing, except for the fact that God chose to use this term towards Zerubbabel to show favor. But this in no way proves that God decided to lift the curse of Jeconiah or that it was already lifted. As a matter of fact, you will not find even the slightest iota in either chapter of Haggai that makes any reference to Jeconiah or the curse at all. Not one reference. Zerubbabel being made as a signet does not mean that Jeconiah's curse was lifted. Secondly, according to the context of this passage, this is what some people would call a dual prophecy. Now, I'm not 100% on the actual definition, but to my understanding, a dual prophecy is a revelation from God where the one prophecy that's given is targeted towards one person or one group of people, while at the same time attributing the attributes of a completely different person or different group of people that have not yet existed or has already existed long before. See, God can talk to two completely different people living at completely different times at the same time. So in doing so, he's telling of an event that has yet to come or that has already passed long before, according to human time. And that's exactly what's happening here in Haggai 2:23. See, this passage cannot possibly make Zerubbabel the actual subject, which is probably why a great majority of believers assert that this prophecy in Haggai 2:23 concerning Zerubbabel is messianic. When the Lord said that he would make Zerubbabel as a signet, this does not mean that Zerubbabel would become a king or that the curse would be lifted. See, if we're going to consider the context, the first thing we should be asking is, what day is the Lord referring to? And if we're doing honest and proper exegesis, we would see what that day is. For instance, God says on that day, God will shake the heavens and the earth. God says on that day that he will overthrow kingdoms. God says on that day that he will overthrow the chariots and those that ride in them. So these events, which are, by the way, also mentioned and reiterated in several other places in the Old Testament, are in reference to the coming of the Messiah. And we can see those examples in Isaiah 13, Joel 2, Joel 3, Micah 5, Zechariah 9, Zechariah 14. These are events that only pertain to the day of the Messiah, the day of his second coming, when he comes back. But wait a minute, Jay, hold on. If this is the Messiah, then how come the Lord refers to him specifically as Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel? Again, this is a dual prophecy, since we can see clearly that Zerubbabel would not see this day during his lifetime. This proves that it's not ultimately about Zerubbabel. Again, the attributes of this particular prophecy pertains primarily to the Messiah. And as for him being referred to by name, well, we can also see in Scripture that it was not uncommon for the prophets to refer to the Messiah by the name of David. We can see examples of this in Jeremiah 30, Ezekiel 34, Ezekiel 37, and Hosea 3. See, the prophets did not know the Messiah's name at that time, so they referred to him using a title that they used in honor of God, honoring King David. And in the same way, Zerubbabel is made as a signet for the Lord. But wait a minute, doesn't that still prove that Zerubbabel was biologically related to Christ? No, it does not. Because first of all, you'd have to prove that the Zerubbabel we see in both genealogies are the same exact person. If that's the case, then why does he have a different grandfather and a different son? You also still have the problem of Nathan being mentioned in Luke instead of Solomon. Why? Because neither Shealtiel or Zerubbabel were descendants of Nathan. Now, obviously, the Lord deemed Zerubbabel as an honorable man in the history of Israel. With that said, perhaps we can look to Haggai 2:23 in another way and assert that Zerubbabel being made as a signet is in reference to God simply holding him in high regard. With that notion, it most certainly would make sense that there would be other members of Judah that would name their sons Zerubbabel in honor of this man.